Well, I'm here with the composer Matthew King, who's recently written an extraordinary new work called Richard Wagner in Venice, a Symphony, which the Mahler Players recently commissioned, and he's very kindly agreed to say a few words about it today. So, Matthew, welcome, and thanks so much for taking the time to talk about your new piece, Richard Wagner in Venice, a Symphony, which the Mahler Players commissioned from you earlier this year. Now, this is an extraordinary piece which takes some of Wagner's last compositional fragments and sketches and combines them and elaborates them together into a 20-minute single-movement symphony. Quite an extraordinary achievement. I was looking back at my diary, and we've actually been in touch about this for almost 4 years, I think. So that feels like quite a long time. But you've actually been interested in this idea for much longer than that. So if you could tell me a little bit about how you first heard about the sketches and how you first became interested in this project.
Well, thanks, Thomas. It's it goes back a long way. It's probably a decade or more. I think that my interest originated, back in 2011 or something. I think I was reading an abridged version of Cosima Wagner's diary. I'd sometimes read bits out aloud to my wife because it was so funny. Cosima Wagner was an extraordinary lady who, she was Wagner's second wife. She's the daughter of Franz Liszt, and she rather obsessively documented their life together, taking down almost everything he said as if it was sort of holy writ. And so it's all there in the diary, this bizarre, incredibly detailed compendium of life with Richard. And so, which is a weird thing in itself, but of course invaluable for anyone who's interested in the way that he was thinking in the last decade of his life. And one of the striking things that you discover when you're reading some of these is how often he talks about symphonies and instrumental melodies and things. And there's one melody that she calls the Parazzi melody, which he keeps playing, and he plays it to her when she's in the bath and things like that. And I remember reading this and thinking, oh, what the hell is this? Because it's not in his published works. What are these pieces that he keeps playing to her? And it was only later when a year or two later, when I got hold of John Deathridge's book, with a chapter called Unfinished Symphonies, where he lays out the whole story about Wagner planning a symphonic project at the end of his life. I mean, right at the end of his life, and how it seems as if after Parsifal, he'd had enough. He didn't want to write operas anymore. It was as if, his whole trajectory was turning towards instrumental music. And, typically of Wagner, he was never lacking in ambition, was he? He's done opera. He's got the T-shirt. Now he's moving on to radically rethinking instrumental composition, and that's the next project. And he's talking about it even the week before he dies. And then, he's, in fact, Cosima talks about him getting together his sketches, his runaways, his little bits of material that he sketched out, and he's sorting them out a day or two before he dies. And then they're living in Venice, overlooking the Grand Canal. He has a massive heart attack and dies in her arms, and that's it. No symphony, but it's tantalising. This is something that could have been revolutionary and could have been a whole new creative vista in his life, but it never happened.
And talking about these sketches, roughly how many are there, and how developed or undeveloped are they?
Well, as far as I know, and I'm very reliant on John Deathridge's amazing book, where you can see 10 or more sketches reproduced in that book. But I think that it's around 10 fragments that have been gathered together and are in an envelope in the Bayreuth archive.
And is there any sort of indication that he intended to use these fragments in a single work?
We don't know because many of them are unlabelled. One of them has Symphony written on it, Symphony Andante. One of them has Tempo di Parazzi, which is the name that Cosima gives the melody in her diary. So we know that that's that melody. Other references to melodies and symphonies in Cosima's diary don't necessarily tie in with the sketches that we have. But it seems likely that some of these melodies that were left are the ones that she's talking about. And often, you know, in Cosima's diary, she'll say things like, she'll describe a conversation between her dad, Liszt, who comes to visit, and Wagner saying to Liszt, you know, Franz, the symphonies of the future, we can't write them like Beethoven. They shouldn't be 4-movement pieces with classical opposition of themes and so on. The future of the symphony of the future should be a great unending melody. You know, this is how we've got to write it, Franz. You know, he's sort of telling Liszt what the symphony of the future should be. And the irony is that it was Liszt, actually, I think, who'd come up with the idea that Wagner then runs with later in his career. And that idea is what you find in Liszt's Sonata, which is a piece from the 1850s. Liszt had written this radical and marvellous sonata in B minor, which compresses the 4 movements of a sonata into a single movement. And that's the idea that really gets going with Wagner, I think. I think he begins to realise how he can reimagine the symphony as a single movement piece.
And I noticed you've been quite insistent right throughout the whole process of working together that what you've produced in this work isn't a completion. In fact, I think you once referred to it as speculative musical archaeology.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that and also about the sort of musical language that you've used in the piece. I mean, to my ears, it sounds very Wagnerian, but perhaps particularly in the latter half, there's a bit of Matthew King coming through as well.
Yeah, maybe there is a tiny bit. I think the speculative musical archaeology feels like the term to use because what I've done is slightly unprecedented. I can't think of anything quite like this, where the piece is based on a collection of really random sketches. We have no idea whether Wagner intended that they belong together and in what sequence. So it's a piece that's where I've had to speculate. I've just put them together in the order that I wanted to. So there's a huge amount of me, and there is no sense in which this is a completion, that this is in no sense a piece that Wagner would have written. But on the other hand, it seems to me that you can't really do a convincing realisation of another composer's work unless you do it within the broad stylistic context of their work. You know, I know Wagner's music, I kind of know how its harmony sounds. And so to me it doesn't make sense to realise the music in any other way, really. The sketches, in order to work properly, have to be realised within the kind of general idiom in which they would have been realised had he written the piece. I know some composers, Luciano Berio, for example, did a completion of, a piece he called Rendering, which was that he took sketches of Schubert's unfinished 10th Symphony and kind of put them in this mosaic with pitch clusters and things. But I personally don't think it works. I think you have to have a go at realising it the way, almost like an imagined way in which the composer would have done it. But you're right, at the end of the piece, I don't even attempt to sound like Wagner. You know, at the very end, there's this kind of funereal gondola ending, and that's, I feel like I've invented that. You know, it's tonal, but it isn't really Wagner. It's kind of me.
Mm. And many people will probably associate Wagner with huge structures. So we think about the Ring Cycle, the 4 operas of the Ring Cycle, 16 hours of music.
Yeah.
Parsifal, if you include the intervals, you'll often have a 6-hour performance. So you've got to start at 3 p.m. so that people can get the last train home.
Yeah.
And not only that, but also huge orchestration, 120 players, often banks of Wagner tubas and so on. Whereas in this piece, it's for a chamber orchestra. I think we had 24 musicians in the performance, and it's about 20 minutes long.
Yeah.
So what do you think made Wagner want to change direction in this way, if he did want to change direction?
Well, yeah, we know that he did, because in Cosima's diary he talks about wanting to write symphonies like the Siegfried Idyll, which is a piece that he'd written for Cosima in 1870, and originally it was titled Symphony. And so his conception of the symphony was, I'm going to do more pieces like that. And he also says in one of the Cosima diary entries, she records him saying he wanted to write more pieces like that and with the same instrumentation or with a similar orchestra. So, it seems as if, and it's not surprising when you think about it, Wagner was a radical person. He wasn't just this kind of gargantuan person. It turns out that his dramatic thinking took him in a sort of maximalist direction with these huge pieces over large spans of time in which the drama unfolds slowly and inexorably, and as you say, you have this huge orchestra. And later composers, particularly Gustav Mahler, for example, picked up on that sort of approach and wrote huge symphonies that unfold very slowly, and that's absolutely magnificent, of course, in his case. But it wasn't the way Wagner was thinking. In fact, the radical side of Wagner seems to have turned in the opposite direction, almost as if he'd had enough. If you think about it, creatively that makes sense, doesn't it? You've done the gargantuan thing. He kind of wants to turn away from that and do something absolutely different. He talks in the Cosima diary, you hear him talking about something sunnier, more cheerful, simpler, taking the whole conception in a new, fresh way. Funnily enough, Nietzsche, who was friends with Wagner, complained after Wagner's death about how he's incapable of taking music in this direction. But in fact, it's almost as if, and John Deathridge's book talks about this, it's almost as if he was quoting Wagner against himself, because it seems as if Wagner was wanting to do this. He was wanting to take his own music in a sunnier instrumental direction, more intimate direction. He talks about the symphonies being diary-like.
And it's interesting you mentioned Siegfried Idyll there, and of course that's the other piece on the album that we're releasing.
Yeah.
Now this is a piece which is very special to me. It's actually one of the first pieces I conducted when I first started conducting at university. And as you mentioned, it has some connections to the symphony. Yeah. So I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that, and also your own relationship to this rather extraordinary piece, because it's played often, isn't it, Siegfried Idyll, but in some funny sort of way it seems at the same time to be a little bit undervalued, perhaps.
I think it's hard to classify, isn't it? Because it doesn't really fit into, it doesn't fit with other genres, and because of the orchestration, perhaps it's hard for conductors to know quite how to schedule it. It gets played, doesn't it? But you're right that I think it's one of the great masterpieces, instrumental masterpieces of the 19th century. And it's funny because Wagner isn't spoken of as an instrumental composer much, because that's his only late work for orchestra. I mean, there is a very good Faust overture written in his late 20s, but Siegfried Idyll is the only kind of mature work. I think it's amazing. You said that your exposure to it was early on. It was the first piece you conducted. I think I first heard it when I was a teenager, and I was a bit disappointed, in fact, because I was expecting... I'd heard the music for Siegfried's Funeral March with all these sort of grand themes from the Ring Cycle, and I thought that was Siegfried Idyll. I was expecting this great big sort of grand Siegfriedy thing, and with all the big tunes that you get in the Ring Cycle, and it disappointed me because it barely had any of the big tunes. In fact, it doesn't really have any of the big tunes. It has the bird song motif, doesn't it? And it has the love theme from Act 3 of Siegfried. But these very intimate things are the melodies that he uses. And what is so wonderful about the piece is it's very classically structured. He uses a kind of loose sonata form, a classical form with first subject and second subject type material, development section, recapitulation. But you wouldn't know any of that because the music, it's like a dream, and he draws you into this really wonderful, idyllic kind of world. Wagner's a great world builder, isn't he? I mean, that's something he does so wonderfully in his operas, but he does it in his instrumental music as well. He draws you into this imaginary place, and it's absolutely special, I think.
And coming back to your piece, one of the things that's really struck me about it is just how organic it all sounds. You wouldn't think that it had come from a collection of disparate sketches in an archive somewhere. So how did it reach this point? And you've been thinking about it for a long time, as you mentioned. Did you find yourself going down dead ends and having to come back and change things? I mean, did it change a lot over the course of the composition, or was it something that happened
it's
more naturally?
Thanks for saying that it's organic, but I had quite a long time to think about these sketches. Once I'd seen them in John Deathridge's book, I sort of thought about them and wondered how to harmonise them and how they might connect with each other, and I had a crack at doing it a couple of times, and my preliminary efforts at doing it weren't terribly convincing. It was initially quite difficult to make them sort of segue into each other. But when we finally got going, you very kindly commissioned the piece, and I had a deadline. There's nothing like a deadline to make you come up with solutions. I actually composed the final version of the piece very quickly, in about 2 weeks. And once you get going, it's a funny thing with any creative process. Once you really get going, things start to fall into place, and there's a kind of rhythm. I could begin to sense how the ideas flowed naturally from one motif to the next, and how I knew from Wagner's own work that he's very good at making one thing merge into another thing, and you get these counterpoints. You get this all over Wagner's late music. Götterdämmerung, for example, one leitmotif mixes with another one in a way that he's never done before. Couldn't have done, in fact, when he was writing Das Rheingold, but by the end of his life he's worked out ways to make these things merge together, and that's something that I wanted to try to imitate that approach. So I'm glad that there is a sense of coherence in the way that the sketches go into each other, because I think that is an essential Wagnerian thing, and if they didn't merge with each other like that, it would somehow sound unconvincing, I think.
Well, it has a wonderful sense of inevitability, I would say, the piece. And the title, Richard Wagner in Venice, a Symphony, again is a sort of mixture of different things, because you've got the first part, Richard Wagner in Venice, which is quite evocative, perhaps, of Thomas Mann's 1912 novella, Death in Venice, and then you've got a symphony, which is much more classical, and you've talked a bit about that. So how did you come up with this title?
I suppose it's a little bit Wagnerian in that when he wrote Siegfried Idyll, he originally called it Symphony, and then he was a little bit scared of publishing it as Symphony, because he'd written earlier on, back in 1850, he'd said that you couldn't write symphonies anymore, Beethoven had finished. So kind of tied down by his own ideology, he wasn't really able to publish it that way. So he published it as the Triebschen Idyll, and with references to birdsong and the golden sunset and so on, which is very poetic, but it misses out the classical part. And I guess I just wanted to bring those two together. We know Wagner was in Venice at the end of his life, thinking about the symphonic project. The sketches were there in the palace, this lovely Renaissance palace overlooking the Grand Canal, and that's where he died. And the music ends with a kind of sense of the funeral gondola, because I even quote a piece that Franz Liszt was writing at that time. He said it came to him as a kind of premonition, because he didn't know that Wagner had died, but he wrote a piece called The Lugubrious Gondola. And I liked the bass line in the piece so much that I just brought it in. It seemed the right thing to do. It seemed to kind of come in at just the right moment. So I used Liszt's accompaniment figure, and then the symphony kind of, it ends up in a sort of watery funeral procession and disappears at the end. That's so at the end of the piece, in a way, autobiography meets, you know, symphonic form or whatever, and they kind of merge together, and that's the way it ends.
Well, it's a wonderful coda to the piece, a fantastic sort of summation.
Thanks.
When it comes to unfinished works in general, whether you're talking about completions or whether you're talking about performing versions, or whether you're talking about, in your case, speculative musical archaeology, it's sometimes an inherently controversial area, isn't it? If to take the material from a dead composer and to resurrect it in some way. So what do you think about that, and what would you say in response, for example, to someone who thought, well, you know, these sketches, they were just left by Wagner, perhaps he didn't want to do anything with them, shouldn't we just leave them as they are for researchers and so on to look at?
Yeah, and I think it always is controversial, isn't it? So when people, you know, have finished Bach's Art of Fugue, for example, or Bag's Lulu was a famous case, wasn't it? More recently, people have attempted to finish, well, of course, Derek Coates' completion of Mahler 10.
And that performing version, I mean, some conductors of the late 20th century, early 21st century refused to play that. I mean, a lot of people did play it, and it sort of entered the repertory now.
Yeah, that's right. And closer to me is a piece that a friend of mine, Anthony Payne, did about 20 years ago, which was the completion of Elgar 3, Elgar's Third Symphony. And in fact, my piece was dedicated to Tony after he died, because he died. I was going to dedicate it to him, but then he died. So it's in memory of Tony Payne, because his work on Elgar's Third Symphony was so masterful and really an inspiration to younger composers like me. So I think, yes, it's controversial, and people will always say you're profiteering out of the ideas of great people or whatever, but I hope that's not my intention. My real interest was the ideas themselves were so strong and so unknown, and it seemed very strange to me that you had this extraordinary story of Wagner wanting to write symphonies at the end of his life, these tantalising fragments. Isn't it exciting? You know, there's something almost Agatha Christie-like about trying to solve that puzzle. And the piece my piece is a sort of what if, isn't it? It's imagine if Wagner had done this. I'm not saying of course I'm not saying this is what he would have done, but I'm just imagining the possibility. But yes, there's always going to be controversy, and people, you know, you can't please everybody when you do this kind of thing.
Indeed. Well, Matthew, thanks so much for talking today about your new work. It's been a huge privilege for us at the Mahler Players to be the first people to play it and to record it and then to premiere it. So thank you so much.
It's been a great privilege for me listening to you guys playing it, and to hear these sounds coming to life, you know, after 130 years or whatever. Very exciting. Indeed.
And in fact, we should mention the place where we recorded it, Strathpeffer Pavilion, which is a building in the town of Strathpeffer in the Highlands of Scotland, actually has an extraordinary connection to Wagner and to Bayreuth, because it was, we only discovered this recently, but it was designed following I think a casino in Baden-Baden.
Apparently so.
And indeed, and then this casino was itself modelled on the Festspielhaus.
Yeah, who'd have thought? We were in the Strathpeffer Pavilion, and I think I noticed that it was built in 1883. Is that right? I think it was
1881. I think.
Right,
yeah,
1881.
Yeah.
But it kind of even looks a bit, but it looks Bavarian, doesn't it? Like so much stuff in Strathpeffer, so many things in Strathpeffer, the buildings. So yeah, there is something a bit Wagnerian about it. It was lovely acoustic in there, wasn't it?
Wonderful. Yes. Yeah. Well, Matthew, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas.